It's basically about how the Buddha and Christ taught a very similar message, which is love and compassion. And for me, as kind of a comparative religion scholar, novice scholar, amateur scholar, and universalist mystic, when the realization that those two massive figures of humanity had such a, distinctly clear overlap, as articulated by Thich Nhat Hanh in that book, that forms a real central core of who I am today.
If you wanted to learn more about philosophy and spirituality but felt intimidated by ancient Greek or Sanskrit, is it too embarrassing to admit that we are more than the body? Are you afraid to bring up reincarnation over coffee? Well, we love coffee, and Plato, Buddhism, and Sri Ramana Maharshi. And we think these teachers and systems have some use today. This is the Beware How Show. Mystic philosophy made practical. I'm Bob, speaking weekly with Scott and Ryan. We're three conscious creatives and formerly closeted mystics trying to unpack the inaccessible. According to the mystics, the truth cannot be spoken, but we'll try to talk about it anyway.
Hello, I'm Bob, and this is the Beware How Show, speaking with Scott and Ryan. Today is Monday, June 15th, and today, Scott waved. Today we're discussing Buddhism, and just to start off, there's a concept within Buddhism that I really like called metta, or loving kindness, and so the world is in a pretty kind of wild state due to the pandemic and due to kind of racial injustice, historic protests, and all this, civil unrest. The news is crazy. Social feeds are crazy. So I'll just say in beginning and centering our episode on Buddhism, kind of Buddhism 101, may all beings be at ease. May all beings be happy is really what metta is. The format of this program is based on 3 acts. The first act is kind of personal realizations around this material, how we kind of came into it just as individuals. Then moving into context around the philosophy or concept. That's going to be a big part of this one in Buddhism, but so is the last act, which is the practical application of. We want to kind of have an act 3 where we give useful tips and advice about how to work with this material. Buddhism is all about practicality, so hopefully we'll have some good ones by then. If that sounds good to you guys.
Let's do it. Yeah, sounds good to me.
Awesome. Cool. So, again, Buddhism is a world religion. It's hilarious and preposterous to think that we would cover all of it in 90 minutes. But, hopefully you get kind of a nice intro into who he was. Also, just the Buddha was a historical figure. He was pretty cool. He said some cool stuff. And kind of what he was trying to get across, maybe who are some favorite teachers since him. Yeah, that's kind of what I want to dig in. But before that, as far as my own introduction to Buddhism, we've talked a little bit about our backgrounds. The Christianity episode I really liked. That I think is like the least clicked one because I don't know. I've just like looked at the metrics and like all of them except the Unraveling Christianity one it's like all of them and then like the Christianity one. So go back and check that one out. It's really good. We, we got real vulnerable with it. And, basically as a kind of, for me, I was 16 or 17 and grappling with, really enjoying the teachings of that old Galilean and couldn't really deal with the hypocrisy of the, vast majority of folks who claim to follow his teachings, and stumbled on this book in a South Austin bookstore by Thich Nhat Hanh called Living Buddha, Living Christ. We Thich Nhat Hanh, we discussed him pretty extensively in the mindfulness episode number 1. But you can't talk about him enough. He's just like one of the most amazing humans. He has this quality of just like answering a question on YouTube, like in an old video, and you just like get so peaceful, like hypnotically. He just carries this sense of, I think he's late 80s or early 90s. Decades, when you've done this work for that many decades, he kind of has this, it's like lighthearted and soft, but he's also traversing kind of the fullest depths of humanity at the same time. So, just a huge fan of him. And he was kind of my way in. I loved that title, Living Buddha, Living Christ. And, it, stopped 16-year-old Bob roaming through the aisles, and it was beautiful. I mean, it's basically about how the Buddha and Christ taught a very similar message, which is love and compassion. And for me, as kind of a comparative religion scholar, novice scholar, amateur scholar, and universalist mystic, when the realization that those two massive figures of humanity had such a, distinctly clear overlap, as articulated by Thich Nhat Hanh in that book, that forms a real central core of who I am today, in kind of the brotherhood of those two beings that both religions in their name don't really acknowledge, or they haven't really acknowledged very much in the past, kind of East and West. And, there's kind of gap bridgers like Vivekananda, like Thomas Merton, who've written about the similarities, but it's pretty cool considering how similar they were and how similar their message was. So that was kind of my intro to Buddhism, and it's snowballed over the years. I don't consider myself a Buddhist necessarily, but all the practices, I think, which we'll get into today, around practical psychology. It's all very mental and very kind of self-awareness, and mind training is a huge part of Buddhism, and it's super valuable. So we'll definitely spend some time with it. But I'll also formally pass the mic to you guys.
Go for it, Scott. I don't have much of a background in Buddhism. I probably, my introduction was hearing that my uncle is a Buddhist, because he has been for since before I was born, I guess, my dad's brother. And maybe not coincidentally, both of his children have spent many years living in ashrams now, in the more Hindu side of it. But that was, something I had heard early on, and having, been raised in a traditionally Christian family, that, I got to hear a little of the, I guess you could call it the gossip of maybe some other aunts or uncles, wondering why that's what he was and what the difference were. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, so that was maybe my introduction, but I I've read about him over the years since then, and I think one of the first things that jumped out at me was the notion that he was somewhat of an animal rights guy, weirdly. Like, I remember, in fact, I think I had that pulled out. He said something, I had forgotten it, and so I found it again. He said once to a king, "If the sacrifice of a lamb helps you to go to heaven, sacrificing a man will help you better, so sacrifice me." And the king was astonished that he was willing to put his life in place of the lambs.
Straight
and
to
I was
it.
like, I kind of like this guy. So anyway,
Super,
that
that's
was
very metal.
Yeah. So maybe that's what got me more interested, and just kind of been, Yeah, I don't know if I've ever really, did a deep dive on him but I definitely learned about him more through, took a lot of religious studies classes at UT, and got to learn a bit more about him after that. But yeah, definitely no expert over here. So that's my story, I guess.
That's great. Yeah, I didn't realize your uncle was. I mean, Sanjay Ananda, formerly Aaron Stanley.
Yeah.
I'm sure we'll get him as a guest. I mean, he's way up there on the list.
Yeah, I would
to
love
join
to.
us, who has been in an ashram for many years. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I guess he did split with his father theologically at some point, which we'll have to make sure to ask him about that development. And,
Yeah.
if his Buddhist father accepts his Hindu beliefs, but
Yeah, I mean, is that a split, or yeah, would that be? I mean, obviously, coming from like a Christian tradition, it's less of a split. But I'd be curious to ask him
right.
too, like what those differences are, why he chose, vice versa. Yeah, that'll be a interesting.
Yeah, I
chat.
would just say briefly, because I want to hear Ryan's thing and I want to get into the concept, but I would say briefly that there definitely are differences between Hinduism and Buddhism, and
Yeah.
Basically Buddhism is kind of agnostic, and Hinduism is as a whole more devotional to the divine. So
Mm-hmm.
loving God or not might be a point of contention at the dinner table at the Stanley household. Hopefully it's not for them. I'm sure it's not. And Buddha was a Hindu. I mean, I kind of wrote this thing here, but he reformed Hinduism just like Jesus reformed Judaism. So kind of back to the comparative religion piece, what great saints do are great even beyond that. Maybe even Christ or Buddha's probably up level saints, but what spiritual masters do typically is they reform the kind of clunky institutional systems of their time. So anyway, I could talk for 4 hours about that. You go, Ray.
Right on. Thanks, Scott. Yes, so let's see, my introduction to Buddhism, I don't remember exactly when it was. I believe it was probably just a couple years after I moved to Austin. Almost 9-10 years ago. And I was kind of studying Hinduism with you, Bob, at the time, and Kriya Yoga. And I think the first Buddhist teacher I came across was Tara Brach, who is still to this day the most consistent Buddhist teacher that I listen to and read.
Awesome.
Which is really cool. I think I had found her podcast and just started kind of digging through her archives, and just so much good stuff in there. Very contemplative and very rooted in a mindfulness practice. And it definitely, coming from learning Kriya Yoga and learning about the devotional aspects of Hinduism, and hearing this approach from her, which was more, this almost like mind training, this like a little bit more on work on the inside type stuff. And it was just super fascinating. And so I listened a lot to her. I think I listened to a couple audiobooks from Pema Chodron as well, which I'm a big fan of also. I think that probably led me to Jack Kornfield as well. Jack Kornfield has a great audiobook. He's got a lot of great audiobooks, but one on Audible is A Beginner's Guide to Buddhism, which is great. Just literally starts at the very beginning and explains all of it. And I highly recommend that for anyone interested in Buddhism. And then, I think last year or the year before, I read Pieces Every Step by Thich Nhat Hanh. I didn't know much about him besides, I think, maybe coming up in conversation with you, Bob. And And that book was, yeah, amazing as well. Just another really beautiful dive into like the practice of mindfulness, learning how to wash dishes in a mindful way. You know, he will take mindfulness to every single aspect of your life, which is really awesome to just hear his approach to life in that way. And yeah, I think that covers a lot of like
Great influences.
a lot of my, I guess, explorations into Buddhism. Who else? I feel like someone else
Shout
just
out
came
to
to
Jack
mind.
Kornfield.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, Jack Kornfield wrote when Ram Dass died, the late great, who influenced us so much. Jack Kornfield knew him for 40 years and went to India with him even. And I read a lot of eulogies in December of Ram Dass, and Jack Kornfield's it's not a competition, but his just wrecked me. I mean, it was beautiful. It was extreme. I mean, it was the best eulogy of Ram Dass, which is
Nice.
Pretty impressive considering there were thousands.
Yeah. I'm going to have to check that out. I don't think I saw it.
Yeah, I'll send it to you. It is amazing.
Cool.
It went kind of like Ram Dass Sangha viral.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I would say that out of all of the kind of religions that I've, you know, just read about and learned and explored, I think I resonate mostly with Buddhism, out of all of them. I don't think I would consider myself a Buddhist, but I mean, on a weekly basis, the people that I'm reading and listening to, it's largely almost entirely Buddhism, actually, at this point in my life right now. So, yeah, I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan of the kind of the mind training aspect. I think it's really fascinating stuff to me. And it's especially in a practical manner, you know, being able to apply it to your kind of everyday life. I think that's what attracts me to it so much, is that it's really easy to apply it to your everyday life. And yeah, I think that covers it.
That's great. No, that's awesome. Thanks for sharing. And yeah, the practicality is so huge. In kind of also this, as we talked in the mindfulness episode, but just the whole kind of modern day mindfulness movement is you know, almost entirely derived from Buddhist practices. It's just kind of stripped away from, you know, Indian Buddhism and Chinese and Vietnamese and Japanese Buddhism is kind of stripped from all those cultural rituals that carry the psychology and the traditions. But you know, it's definitely been secularized, and as we talked in that episode, we don't have to rehash that. But you know, I think there's a lot of benefit from just kind of serving it up on this kind of secular platter for people who, you know, might have left their upbringing religion, you know, kind of left Christianity or something else, and kind of, you know, aren't interested in religious institutional stuff, but they might be suffering, and Buddhism is entirely, I mean, almost entirely focused on.
Yeah.
I mean, you could probably actually say get rid of the almost.
Yeah.
The whole purpose of Buddhism is to cease suffering. As we'll cover here. So it's a useful practice for all suffering beings.
Yeah.
Which is everyone.
The other big one that I just remembered was the Tao, which is Taoism is a variant of Buddhism. Yeah.
It's definitely overlaps. Lao Tzu is ancient Chinese philosophy, but what you're thinking of, which we did talk about in one of the episodes, but the Tao, when Buddhism came from India, he was an Indian Hindu, and as it went across the continent, headed eastward, particularly there was a guy named Bodhi Dharma who was kind of the founder of Zen, or Chan, seen the pronunciation of it. When Buddhism basically hit China and Japan, it merged, or it kind of hit into Chinese Taoism.
I see.
And Zen came from that. So Zen Buddhism is kind of a sectarian, just like Christianity has Protestants, Catholics,
Yep.
Greek Orthodox, etc. Buddhism has Mahayana, Theravada, Vajrayana, etc. And with it, under Mahayana, those are kind of the main three. Under Mahayana is Zen, and so the Zen Buddhist Lao Tzu is kind of an honorary member, even though he predated.
I see. Well, shout out to the Tao too, because that is
no
book.
kidding. It really is. Yeah, no, and I think they're right at home with each other.
Yeah.
I mean, it's why it's so natural to combine them.
Yeah, the I have the Tao is a great little book for anyone that hasn't. I mean, the Tao Te Ching is it's kind of canon in Taoism and Chinese culture in that way, but
I'd say modern Eastern mysticism, of which the Buddhism bookshelf takes up a good amount. I think you should definitely have that one on there.
Yeah, the Tao Te Ching, it's spelled TaoTeching. And there's on Audible, there's a reading by Stephen Mitchell that I just adore so much. I love his reading. I love his translation of it, because every version you read will be translated by someone. But I love his translation and his reading of it. It's one of those kind of audiobooks I can literally go to any section in it at any moment and just listen for a few minutes, and it's oftentimes exactly what I needed to hear. So
I love it when that happens
beautiful.
with an audiobook. You're just like, oh,
right?
That's what I needed to hear today.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ouija board style spirituality.
Right.
That's how I roll. I mean, that's what Richard talked about a lot. He would say, like, our Apache shaman friend, hey, open the book, you'll be guided to the information you need.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is veering us heavily off course from the Buddhism. So here we go.
Let's bring it back.
Let me just I'll just give a really tight kind of who is the Buddha piece. And I wrote a thing on the avatars that's coming out either via email or just bewarehow.com, plug marketing emails, that stuff, you'll get this information if you hang out with us digitally. I don't know exactly when or how, but it's going to be available. So that's a terrible, I'm just going to stick to the spirituality side and not the promotional side. This is from that piece. But basically, yes, the Buddha's name was Siddhartha Gautama. He was born a wealthy prince in India in around 563 before the Common Era. BC. The BCE, by the way, just a quick footnote, is kind of the new BC. Like by the time I was in religious study school, they had gotten rid of BC, like before Christ, and AD, Anno Domini, or year of our Lord. It's very Christian centric, and so what they did within the past few decades is it's before Common Era is BCE, formerly BC, and then CE is Common Era, which is, I think I'm with the non-Christian institution view of that, I think.
Yeah.
Sorry, Puritan Christian fathers of America. We've left your...
Yeah, sorry guys.
They still got the Gregorian calendar,
right?
So, but it's just we're taking the acronyms back. So anyway, 563 before Common Era, and the Buddha as a boy, as a little kid, and really his kind of young life, he was sheltered from the world. His father was a king, and he consulted a priest who kind of did a Vedic astrology read on his son's birth, and he said he would be one of two things. He's either going to be a great warrior king known for his conquests, or he's going to be a famous saint known for his teachings. and the king did not want to lose his heir to the monastic life. So he said, I want the king one because I get to choose what my son's going to do. And so he just sheltered him his whole life. He stayed in the castle grounds, and at some point, Prince Siddhartha grew tired of being confined to the palace grounds. He convinced a charioteer to take him out into the city, kind of mid-20s, basically, and there he saw what became known as the four sights. First, he saw an old man, which made him know aging. He didn't know what that was before. And then a sick man, illness, and then a dead man, showing him mortality and impermanence. And then the fourth sight was a monk, Hindu monk, as kind of a potential of a way out of the other three. And so kind of spiritual practice in an attempt to end the suffering. You can only imagine the kind of conscious evolution that would take forth from getting those four and already being kind of a contemplative person. And so he ultimately left. He kind of escaped the palace, and he became an extreme ascetic in the early, I think it was a couple of years actually, in his early years of kind of trying to find the answer to beating the first three sights, and he almost died. He went hard into prolonged fasting and ate a grain of rice a day kind of thing, and he basically realized this isn't it. That's not the answer. I'm too weak to meditate and think, and that was an important realization to have. And then he famously sat under this kind of tree called the Bodhi Tree and reached enlightenment. He sat for, I believe it was 40 days, and that feels kind of mythical, so I'm not going to... And it's also strangely very, in line with Abrahamic traditions, the 40 days aspect. But, anywho, he resolved... The main piece there was he resolved to not move from the spot until reaching it, and he just had this kind of firm determination, was tempted by Mara, similar to kind of Christ tempted by Satan, cough, cough, and then, he came into this awakening. The Buddha translation is the awakened one. And so his kind of foundational precepts, his foundational teachings are called the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. And those are kind of the, core teachings of what he was got across. He had a long period of life, actually, many decades of teaching after the fact, which Jesus didn't. Jesus only had a few years. But yeah, basically the Four Noble Truths, what are they? The first truth is this world is suffering, which I think a lot of people, as you get older, realize that's true. And, essentially what his prescription is that desire creates suffering. Our desire or our attachments sometimes is translated as clinging to external kind of ambitions, or what create that suffering, that sense of, it's called dukkha, which means unsatisfactoriness, basically, suffering or unsatisfactoriness. That unsatisfactoriness of the human condition is what kind of sustains the whole thing. And so the third noble truth is ceasing desire ceases suffering. Easier said than done, obviously. That's a nice theory, but it takes a lot of kind of incremental progress and incremental work to kind of break down those desires and that attachment to our ambitions, to the external stimuli in the world. And essentially the fourth noble truth is basically the idea that this eightfold path thing of ethical living is what aids the cessation of desire. That's what aids the third noble truth. So the eightfold path is kind of this prescription for how to best set yourself up to be able to cease those desires. if you're not doing the Eightfold path, it's going to be even harder to do that. So that's pretty much it. We can clock out now.
All right. See y'all next week.
See ya. But, the Four Noble Truths is kind of like the Beatitudes for Jesus. It's like, if you want to understand this one, very Buddhism 101, you talk about that one. And I think there's a book I'm getting through. I'm not quite done yet, but it's just called Why Buddhism Is True. Super cool book by this guy, Robert Wright, who's a professor. And he, essentially in line with the mindfulness and in line with the secularization of Buddhism, talks a lot about how, stripped away from, now there are like astral components because there's reincarnation, although there's anatta, which is non-self. We'll get into the metaphysics too, but just from a psychological standpoint, essentially what Robert Wright and what many kind of Buddhist scholars talk about is that like the Four Noble Truths, like that lines up with modern psychology. That lines up with, Robert Wright was an evolutionary psychologist. He wrote The Moral Animal, is his kind of first biggest book. And, kind of how natural selection is all based on gene spreading, and that we kind of have, we delude ourselves, our system. Natural selection deludes our minds in order to spread genes. And, essentially his point in the book is like what Buddhism does is it helps us become free of that. It helps us kind of notice these delusions for what they are, as kind of a false cause and effect system, and, allow them to dissipate. Now, of course, there's reincarnation involved, because Buddhism, I'd say the ultimate end goal of Buddhism is nirvana, which is kind of breaking the chains of birth and death, similar to Hinduism, which is breaking samsara. It's also called the wheel of birth and death. But there are distinctions, which we can talk about, or you guys can also jump in. I feel like I'm going on and on like usual.
It is kind of amazing how modern Buddhism feels to me. It just I guess the focus on mind training and maybe the de-emphasis of like metaphysics or any supernatural. Although there are, it's not that it's totally devoid of supernatural stories, or like I remember one of the things I remember about his story is after him going through a lot of his trials and everything, he was sitting at the river and decided, said, if I'm on the right path, let this bowl flow in the opposite direction of the river. And he put a bowl in the river, and it like moved against the stream. So like I remember a few, but yeah, overall though, it feels very, like you said, it lines up with kind of modern psychology, and that's always fascinated me. And I imagine is why it's a popular thing these days. I feel like most people are
kind of like post Enlightenment era.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of people are familiar
like
with
rational
those kind of basic
thoughts.
Tenets. Yeah.
Yeah, I've never heard anyone say Buddhism made me worse.
True. I mean, I will caveat that to say that I think we did this other episode that may or may not be published ever, but it was kind of me, like, I think it was just, again, me, like, talking for 90 minutes at you guys, maybe is why it'll stay unpublished for a while. But one of those points I was, like, so passionate about sharing was, like, there's good and bad in every religion. I think Buddhism as a whole, people who take it up are going to improve themselves. But just to point out, there are terrible Buddhists, particularly militant Buddhists, who were involved in the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar over the past few years, who killed Muslim refugees, that's not an indictment of Buddhism. That's an indictment of kind of the human condition, and I would argue like the ego and like our tendency to kind of mess up a good thing. We're real good at that. But so I just want to asterisk that comment.
Totally.
Right? But you're right. I mean, I think in general, especially kind of post-Christian America, where that's kind of a lot of who we're speaking to in the Beware How project, and through my caffeinated writing and dialogue with you guys, that's kind of who we're trying to connect with, is people that are looking for some way out of their despair or their kind of unsatisfactoriness. Robert Wright said in this book, he's pretty funny too. I'm really enjoying it. And he said the Stones song "I Can't Get No Satisfaction" is, according to Buddhism, the human condition. So
yeah,
it's
yeah,
that liberation of getting out of that just inherent tendency of human suffering is worthwhile. It's a worthwhile pursuit.
Yeah, I think I watched that one of the videos you shared of his interview, and I liked his just kind of reminder that evolutionarily we're designed to desire, because we need to acquire things to stay alive, but that hardwiring almost inevitably leads to suffering, because it's designed to keep us alive, but not necessarily designed to keep us like happy and content all the time. Because if we get happy and content, then we sit down and relax and we die in the evolutionary view of it. So it's this framework is it was a way to address that disconnect between the way we were designed and the way that and what would make us like content in a more profound way, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think what's so cool too about Buddhism and what he taught is the flipping, and the kind of like similar to like some of Christ's parables. I mean, again, from a compared religion piece, like how radical a teaching something like love your enemies is from Jesus. Buddha kind of has all these kinds of similar kind of flips. Like there's this great scene early on in his teaching career where a local governor figure kind of asks him to help him rule. I think he was just listening in and was kind of like, hey, we need guys like you, kind of, he's like a HR department in a corporation or something. And, you're the kind of person we need. And Buddha says, I have severed all ties because I seek deliverance. How is it possible for me to return to the world? Will a fish that has been baited still covet the hook, or an escaped bird love the net? Would a man who has burnt his hand with a torch take up the torch after he dropped it to the earth? Not that interested in what you're offering here, man. I don't want to go back into the prison from which I've escaped.
It's great.
Yeah.
I read this one to you guys a couple weeks ago, but I have to share it again. This is very Christ-like. A foolish man, learning that Buddha observed the principle of great love, which commends to return good for evil, came and abused him. Buddha was silent, pitying his folly. The man, having finished his abuse, Buddha asked him, saying, Son, if a man declined to accept a present made to him, to whom would it belong? And he answered, In that case, it will belong to the man who offered it. My son, said Buddha, you have railed at me, but I decline to accept your abuse and request you keep it to yourself. Will it not be a source of misery to you? The abuser made no reply, and Buddha continued, A wicked man who reproaches a virtuous one is like one who looks up and spits at heaven. The spittle soils not heaven, but comes back and defiles his own person. So just sick burns. But not emotional criticism, more just up-leveling, constantly flipping.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We just have this tendency to live in this this attachment to, Robert Wright talks a lot about like reputation, for example, and how like a lot of our evolutionary framework for our thought processes comes out from hunter-gatherer society, like small tribal communal societies, and your reputation meant a lot then. It kind of compares that to road rage, like when back in the day, if you were insulted in front of the village, you needed to kind of show the abuser that you weren't to be messed with, for the sake of your family and your your future kind of breeding potential. And like he compares that to like road rage. He says like that's where we go, but like you're in a car, you'll never see that person again. Like there's literally zero benefit whatsoever to doing that. And it's Buddhism is especially modern in that it helps us untangle kind of our hunter-gatherer evolutionary psychology tendencies, and
both those tenets kind of turn both the desire is suffering and like love your enemy, they both kind of turn the natural order on its head, because a lot of these things we still feel like road rage or something else. It's like they're vestiges of an earlier version of humanity, and now they make less and less
antagonistic
sense. Yeah, as we go on in our evolution, they make less and less sense, and so these like teachings are almost like a course correction in our evolution, if you want to look at it that way.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's very true. He also says, he talks a lot about the mind, but he also says, hatred does not cease by hatred at any time. Hatred ceases by love. This is an ancient rule. He said, this one's so great. He says, the world does not know that we must all come to an end here, but those who know it, their quarrels cease at once. Yeah, it's a conscious evolution type of teaching for sure. It's getting beyond Neanderthalhood.
I liked too go ahead. Yeah, I was gonna I have to give like infinite props to the like Hinduism teachers for recognizing that he was I don't know if all of them did. I was telling you, I've been listening to Vivekananda lately, and how he describes, I guess I should preface, although you could preface it better, but that, Vivekananda is like a big figure in Hinduism within the last 100 years. And he described the Buddha as like the perfect ideal for the karma yogi, because unlike a lot of other spiritual teachers, he wasn't worried about, doing certain things to get into heaven. He wasn't worried about pleasing a god. He was just wanted to like relieve himself of like the karmic burden, or like that built up, I don't know what to call it, but just he described him as like there was no outside desire. It was just the like self-growth for self-growth's sake, and there was nothing else to it, which meant that he didn't have any other attachments or any other kind of like chains holding him back to get him through that like final self progression of that arrived him at bliss, as I guess nirvana is supposed to be.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, I love Vivekananda is great, and we'll probably do an ep on him and his master Ramakrishna. But yeah, I mean, to your point, to contextualize that a bit more, one of the reasons I tend Hinduism or attend kind of Vedantin is because of its inclusivity. I mean, they're like, oh, that guy's great. He's an avatar. You know, like they don't care.
Yeah.
Like, you know,
They're like,
Jesus
come on in,
is
everyone.
on every altar.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, oh, he's great too. Buddha. Oh yeah, he's an avatar of Vishnu. You know, and the Buddhists are like, what? What are they talking about? You know, he's great. You know, we'll give him our highest honor because we so, you know, can understand and appreciate the sincerity. You know, and Vivekananda, it makes a lot of sense that Vivekananda is a fan of Buddha, despite, you know, separate religions even, but because Vivekananda was so focused on this passionate sense of like getting rid of even like leap of faith. Like he's the opposite of that. He is like all about direct experience and all about like your own self capacity to transcend by your own conscious effort. And like, Vivekananda kind of ties into some transcendentalist stuff and Emerson and like, you know, this kind of like individualism that is rooted in this like unlimited potential is big with Vivekananda. And you know, he sees everything kind of through that lens, and that would include certainly the Buddha's, you know, prescription for unraveling. And I like also that you said that defining your attempt to define nirvana, it took you a second, and that's okay because it's actually it's tough. Typically, how he defines things, how the Buddha defines a lot of these states is with negatives. So that was a great segue because he also, I'm sure, had the same difficulties in describing, for example, enlightenment free of craving, you know, or free of death even possibly, but you know, lack of suffering. You know, you can't really describe it positively, and that's I'd say probably a big difference too between East and West is kind of the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of God and paradise and pearly gates even. I mean, we get very, you know, positively flowery imagery on the Abrahamics, and you got to admire the Buddha for kind of surrendering to the, you know, it's called like unspeakableness of it, or ineffability of transcendence.
Yeah, it's conceptually cleaner because you don't have to point at every detail, and sometimes you can see things better by the relief of what they are not. And so it's a clever way to help the human mind wrap around a rather large concept. Like,
well, and particularly if we're drowning in it.
Yeah.
And caught in it. You know,
yeah. Try to describe water to a fish.
What we're talking about is free of. Exactly. Well, you can't understand a system meta to it. Cool. Let's talk about thoughts, because I know that'll get Ryan going.
I actually had a question that kind of popped up.
Oh, sure.
Are there any, in like Buddhism historically, any kind of cross-sectional places where you find, you know, kind of, I mean, to me, it's kind of a no-brainer, but I'm just wondering if like kind of historically, if you're aware of any places where kind of non-duality crosses into Buddhism.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, that's a great question because it perfectly goes into kind of this tense debate. I was telling Scott about it. I was trying to do some reading before, but to kind of brush up. But there's a concept called anatta, A-N-A-T-T-A, and it means not self or non-self, and in Pali. And it is extremely, I mean, I'd say too, like, if differences between Buddhism and Hinduism, just kind of like introductory comparative religion reader, they would say Buddhism agnostic, Hinduism, you know, pantheism or panentheism or 10,000 gods, you know, Buddhism kind of indifferent. It's very like a surface level almost like a teen reader difference. And I would say Anatta's not that far behind there as far as like in Hinduism, it's called the Atman and Brahman, and that relationship is integral to Atman meaning individual soul, Brahman meaning the all in all, kind of beyond all things. And that closeness and that kind of synergy is the path and existence, etc. Whereas in Buddhism, anatta comes from derivative of like the opposite of that, like anatman. I'm not a Sanskrit scholar, but that there's the an prefix means not self or non-self. And Michael James, who I mentioned about in the Sri Ramana Maharshi material, he talks about that a bit, and he kind of scholarship is there's not one central idea around anatta. It's so heady and it's so conceptually difficult because I think the main question is like, well, how can you have reincarnation without a soul or without a self? What continues on? This is the Dalai Lama, who is kind of the Pope of Tibetan Buddhism. Intro to Buddhism people. He says that, this is his answer to what is anatta and how do you have reincarnation without self. In the Buddhist view, the self or the person is understood in terms of a dynamic, interdependent relationship of both mental and physical attributes. That is to say, the psychophysical components which constitute a person. In other words, our sense of self can, upon examination, be seen as a complex flow of mental and physical events, clustered in clearly identifiable patterns, including our physical features, instincts, emotions, and attitudes, continuing through time. This has become the prevailing philosophical view of Tibetan Buddhism, that this sense of self is simply a mental construct, a mere label given to this cluster of dependently arising mental and physical events in dependence on their continuity. The notion that there's a connection between this life and the events of both our previous existence and future existence follows from the Buddhist understanding of the natural law of cause and effect. For example, although we can speak of yesterday's weather and today's weather as distinct, today's weather is inextricably linked with the weather patterns of yesterday. So even at the bodily level, in the case of our physical health, for example, we know that events in the past affect the present and those of the present, the future. So that's kind of his analogy for understanding how we travel through it all, despite not having kind of an individual soul, if you will.
Right.
And that's, again, Buddhism is it's not a monolith. It's extremely variant from ritual to meditations to these kinds of conceptual philosophies. I was telling Scott before this, even within, for example, within Mahayana and within Vajrayana and within Theravada, there are disagreements on what anatta means, and it's kind of like it gets Buddhists angry, kind of ironically. It gets Buddhists in shouting matches. So I think to answer your question, the concept of anatta, and to me, I think as someone who admittedly might be guilty of from time to time, like lazily ascribing some kind of universalist glaze across. Oh, like it's just like I do that. I do that, and I think one example of that would be like kind of reading into anatta further. You can make the interpretations. Buddhist scholars even do make this interpretation. Michael James, the Sri Ramana scholar, certainly does, which is that it's kind of a semantics question as well, in that non-self or not self could be kind of like almost the separate aspect that is false. Like in Sri Ramana, it's like the Advaita Vedanta non-dual school of Hinduism. Like everything that is separate is false. the oneness. I mean, it doesn't seem like it's similar because everything in Advaita is about the self, capital S, and like go into the self. So it feels from a semantic level like it's oppositional, but I could see the similarities. I mean, I think essentially what both schools would be putting forth is like the idea that separateness or like separate individual self is illusory. It's transitory and therefore unreal. And so kind of going in and finding that in the Advaita school self, or ceasing desire, ceasing suffering, that is a component of separateness within Buddhism, is what brings out liberation.
Right.
It's just different. It could be different ways of describing a similar concept.
Awesome.
Great question. I mean, I think Zen too, as far as like the whole Zen Buddhism kind of vibe, lines up very similarly to Advaita. There's a great, the Bodhidharma is an ancient Zen Buddhist, like I think 500 when it was Common Era, 5th or 6th century Common Era. He has just great. I mean, he says, this is very, to me, sounds like Sri Ramana. Quote, "People of this world are deluded. They're always longing for something, always, in a word, seeking. But the wise wake up. They choose reason over custom. They fix their minds on the sublime and let their bodies change with the seasons. All phenomena are empty. They contain nothing worth desiring. Everything sacred, nothing sacred." He's kind of spoke in koans. Freeing oneself from words is liberation. I mean, that could be a Sri Ramana. His whole teaching was silence, So Zen, I think, gets into like the esoteric side of Buddhism, which, like, if you said like a mystic version of Buddhism, it'd be Zen, and that's kind of where non-duality, where it is.
I like the weather metaphor. It's because it helps. To me, it starts to get into the difference between, like, is it non-dual or is it not? The question really starts to focus on like the paradox of time itself, which I guess that's where my mind goes, because I'm a lot of my sci-fi background. I don't know. There's something about,
because you're getting old.
Yeah, well, yeah, that too. No, I keep coming back to the nature of like a lot of these concepts. I mean, it is a semantics thing, but it's also a thing of it's hard. Some concepts are just so entwined with the paradox of time, and like, am I the same as I was yesterday, as I will be tomorrow? There were changes, but what stayed the same? Like there's just it's easy to get lost in a tangle, which I enjoy doing, but it's it's an interesting question too that Ryan asked for me, because it'll keep my brain spinning for a while of like, what if reincarnation is part of Buddhism, does that imply like a dualism or a non-dualism or self or whatever? But
totally, yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I mean, I think the impermanence aspect that we talked about in the death episode, and kind of like Thich Nhat Hanh school, which he's a Zen Buddhist, but the kind of the practice of like presence. I mean, to kind of move into the practical side here, that's key, and that's also a part of Advaita, and that's also a part of like non-dual traditions. There's another Zen Buddhist, another ancient 12th century named Dogen, and he's great. He says, if you're unable to find the truth right where you are, where else do you expect to find it? It's kind of at odds with that like incremental idea within spirituality, or like I'd say stepping back into the kind of mindful, metaphysical, and non-dual kind of Venn diagram of Beware How. I think the metaphysical stuff is more kind of reincarnation and like incremental growth and like leveling up if you will,
Mm-hmm.
whereas kind of both mindful and non-dual have this like hardcore emphasis on the right now, because that's
Yeah,
all
the
there
here
is.
and now. Your
The past and
mind,
the future are conceptual.
yeah, where your consciousness is at any given moment, and what else matters if not that. That's everything to us. Yeah.
Yeah,
Hmm.
exactly. So this kind of intense focus on presence, and I think the act 3 of the episode is like practical, and I mean I think just meditation helps us to stay in this. And Robert Wright's book also, Why Buddhism Is True, he talks a lot about how his meditation practice has transformed him from kind of this anxious to his tendency to argue with people, his tendency to all these kind of negative qualities. They don't go away, but they certainly get reduced. I mean, obviously Thich Nhat Hanh has pretty much relinquished them, but because he's been doing the work for that many decades. And I mean, Rupert Spira has a book called Being Aware of Being Aware. It gets really like trippy, but but awareness, cultivating awareness, and meditation can help with that by kind of prolonged sits, and even we haven't really talked about this today, but for the secular crowd and kind of the scientific crowd, the amount of scientific research on mindfulness and on mindfulness meditation is astronomical. It's gone up. It goes up like exponentially every year. There was like a couple of studies in like 2000, and then like 10 in 2010, and like there's like hundreds every year now. So the evidence for stress reduction, and I think even moving into like health, personal health, mental, physical, etc. Stress is kind of the amplifier of the degrading of our physical health. So there's so much benefits. Not only can we cease suffering, but we can cease our attachment to kind of anxious thoughts and feelings that delude us.
I'm trying to get better at meditation, like you guys. I'm definitely the least of us three, but I attempted a new I don't know. I've been trying to, because every time I try to sit down and meditate, I have a very frenetic mind, so my mind wanders a lot, and lately I've been trying to get, they say like let the thought come and then let it pass, and that's kind of one of the points of meditation. Is like, don't suppress it, don't be angry when your mind wanders, or try to shun it away. So now in my mind I'll kind of I'll imagine it like I'm standing in front of a conveyor belt, and each thought is just like a thing on the belt that's like passing by me. And if I want to, I'll try to maybe describe the thought, like, oh, what's this package? This one's like, this one's like oozing out of the side, or this one's bulky, or this one's, like something's barking inside of it. Like I've been trying to like, anything to help me, like
a lot of barking on yours.
Yeah. No, but just anything to help me like process that like torrent of what can often be a torrent of thoughts. So I'm
that's
still early stages, but
really useful. And like, don't doubt yourself, because we're like I'm constantly thinking. I even caught myself like looking at my phone to check the time while you were talking. So that's a great example of how present I'm not. But the imagery is typically like a cloud. It's like Thich Nhat Hanh talks a lot about thoughts as kind of clouds passing in the sky. And like Andy from Headspace, which is great. I do like Headspace. He comes from a Buddhist tradition. He's a British guy who just got really good at teaching meditation to non-Buddhists, and made this app that's changed the face of planet Earth with meditation. And one of the images he uses is like, it's like a balloon, like a thought is a balloon, or like just an object passing in the sky, and kind of your awareness is like a feather, like to kind of touch it, or you don't have to pop it, but you can kind of acknowledge it. Just like, there's all kinds of images like that.
I like that. I like the ones that are,
and not be...
I like the ones that are, mine's very industrial factory metaphor, I guess, but that's what works like for me right now. Yeah.
Valves and
clearly I'm a sci-fi dude. Yeah, you
really are.
It's great though. I loved your descriptions of those different types of thoughts.
Thanks. Yeah, it helped. I was like, sometimes a package comes and it's wrapped in watches because it's like a thought about time, and like that's one of those ones,
the ticking.
Yeah,
that's so good.
Love it.
So that's my practical advice, even though I don't know if it works yet, but that's what I got.
That's great. No, that's really good. There's really kind of two main types of meditation. One is open awareness and one is guided. And they kind of have different uses. I mean, meditation is like sports, to steal Richard Davidson's quote. There's so many different kinds and so many different traditions, and non-secular and non-secular. And but I think at its core, you either can kind of sit and kind of focus on the breath and open awareness, which is, I think we talked about that in the creative episode. You can get stuff. You can get really good inspiration if you can get really still, but also guided. I mean, especially for people who are new to it, they think, do I just sit or what? And there's also a great book, man, I'm glad I'm thinking of this too, called 10% Happier, which kind of got huge a few years ago by a guy named Dan Harris, who is he's like an ABC news anchor who had he had an anxiety attack live on air, and you can watch it on YouTube, and he like loves to point people to it. He was just like taking prescription pills, and I think he was doing cocaine a bunch. But he also came back from like war coverage. He was a war journalist.
Wow.
And so he had kind of traumatic stuff going on, and like he literally just like couldn't talk to the camera, and that's when he picked up meditation. And he's kind of like hardcore secular guy, almost to the point where like he's not for me. Like I'm very Yogananda devotee and Vivekananda and those guys, but for people who he's great for if you don't have the resurrection of Christ within you on your bookshelf. Dan Harris is great because his book is called 10% Happier, and it's like people would be like, he came up with it in the newsroom. People were like, "You're meditating? Like, what the hell?" And he's like, "Is it working?" And he'd be like, "I'm like 10% happier." And so that's good. And anytime he's in interviews, it's kind of annoying though, because he's like meditation. I thought it was for like people who like listen to Inya and like that. I'm like, come on. He's so like, I get it. You're secular, but anyway.
He's trying to talk
that's
to
my like riff as like a
dad in
devotee
East Texas or something.
Yeah. He's like, I thought you had to have like tapestries on your wall if you liked meditation. I didn't know, Anyway, it is great despite my riffing on him, and he has a really great FAQ on the website to just Google like 10% Happier FAQs. It's kind of like, how long should I meditate? Should I sit on the floor, or like, what do I think about? Like, it's just a really great kind of basic thing. And, to that point, my initial point was open awareness and guided meditation. There's a lot of great guided meditations. Some you can use kind of affirmations that are Buddhist or non-Buddhist, but to kind of bring it all back to the very beginning of this episode, this idea of loving kindness is a huge part of Buddhism, and it's emphasized in some traditions more, in some traditions less, but there are loving kindness meditations, and they are very powerful, and they are very beautiful, because you sit with essentially you start out with having love for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And you take a few minutes doing that. And Sharon Salzberg, I should also shout out to her, speaking of Jack Kornfield earlier,
Yeah.
Sharon Salzberg founded the Insight Meditation Society with him in the East Coast in the 70s. And she's kind of known for this. She's kind of known for LVKMs. And so check her out. But I've done some loving kindness meditation work, and particularly if you're upset, if you're angry, there's an aspect of it. Spoiler alert, what happens in a loving kindness meditation is you start with yourself, and then you go to your loved ones, and then you go to someone you have a conflict with. It's kind of a third step. And typically the last step is all beings. And if you make it, to the 10, 15 minutes of that progression, it's like a vibration bath. It's just, it can be very powerful. So shout out to the loving kindness tradition.
Sounds great. I'll have to try.
Yeah,
it.
I was gonna say too, Scott, there's like no right or wrong way to meditate. There's like all sorts of different ways you can meditate. Walking meditations are just as, can be just as powerful. And I feel like that I even was just thinking about you and your practice with your dog walking, and I wouldn't be surprised if that I'm sure is kind of a meditative aspect for you, I'm sure.
Yeah, that's probably why I like hiking through the forest.
Yeah.
Totally.
But yeah, I always find that I was just, as I was listening to you guys talk, just like thinking about like when am I like really pulled to meditate? And for me, it is when I find myself in my head too much. That is when I am really pulled to meditate, because for me, it's a very grounding experience, very grounding practice. And for me, it's really about listening to your body. And that's part of the reason that it's focused. The root is kind of focused on your breath, right? It's really listening to your body and trying to kind of get out of your head a bit. And so, yeah, for me, that's always been when I've been called most, when I'm like, just like, whenever I feel like I really feel like some meditation would help me in this moment. It's oftentimes because my head is just like going a million miles an hour. And I feel kind of really out of my body, right? I feel kind of like lost in kind of the chaos of my head. And for me, just sitting down and the practice of just breathing slowly and listening to my breath, and like just, it's kind of the intro to Vipassana meditation is a body scan. It's kind of where you start with Vipassana meditation, and scanning your body, like literally from the top of your head down to the tips of your toes, every single aspect, and spending 20 to 30 seconds on each kind of part of your body. And it really like gets you out of your head, and just gets you, that's literally all it does. That's the point, is to get you out of your head, right? It doesn't even matter what body part you're focusing on. It's just like spending time trying to get your mind out of your head and just focused on your body and how your body's feeling. Because your body is, for me, is, I think when I feel most peaceful and most calm and most grounded is when I'm most listening to my body, and I'm like kind of out of my head, right? I'm feeling my body and listening to my body. I've talked about it before. A lot of my work with Jennifer Miller has been listening to my body kind of as a tuning fork. And listening to that and how am I feeling, is like, how is my body feeling? Cause that really tells me a lot, not so much like what is my mind feeling or what is my mind thinking? Cause that often is not exactly how I'm feeling. It's what's distracting me. So yeah, I mean,
you're a true contemplative. Just the fact that your practice is noticing your own dissonance, and then you sit, that very your advanced level contemplative beyond a lot of people, by just, that's your prescription for uneasiness.
Oh, totally.
I love it.
Yeah. I mean, I do wish that I had, my meditation practice comes in, everything moves in waves. I try not to, if I go for a while without meditating, I really try not to like judge myself for that. I just kind of try and flow with it. But I do wish it was a little bit more consistent, I suppose. But also I there's a part of like a certain amount of like releasing control around that, which has been a big part of my practice too. So, but absolutely, yeah. When I'm feeling chaotic, that is what I like to do, is to kind of sit down and like kind of force myself back into my body.
I was sitting on and off for about 8 years, and then about a year and a half ago, it became daily, and like 100% 2020. And it's because if I don't, I'm more likely to be a Neanderthal.
Totally.
And that realization was huge.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so much so that my wife will be like, "Will you go sit, like, please?" Like, it's very like, she's like, "Yeah, go sit." Like, we just had a baby in February. You guys know this, but like, he sits with me, and like that's kind of how we start the day.
That's amazing.
But like, it's definitely like it's insurance for me to not Bruce Banner. And it takes that realization, I think, to establish a regular practice, or at least it did for me, to go, hey, this is cool, I feel better, but like to really, again, noticing, but like at the end of the day, be like, wow, I lashed out for no reason, or why did that make me upset? That's such a trivial thing, to ignite me. Oh, I didn't sit, or oh, I didn't, so on and so on. And kind of once I did that enough tallies, on the whiteboard, to be like, oh, every time I acted a fool, on some stupid thing, it tended to not have a morning kind of foundational, energy set.
Sure.
Yeah.
So
That's
I
awesome.
want the, I want the improved version of me every day. I'm tired of that other one, and it's a work in progress. Again, I guess that's why I'm not a Zen Buddhist, because it is very,
always will be.
It is very incremental for me. It's very it does feel like next update,
lifelong student.
Install next update every other day. But yeah, exactly. But cool. Well, awesome. Well, hopefully that was helpful for people. And yeah, thanks, guys. I think, Buddhism is such a complex thing, but it's also simple. I guess I'm caught in the opposites of it. Complex, diverse tradition, a lot of different sects, a lot of different rituals and concepts, but also, it's simple. It's based in this idea of ceasing suffering and some practical tools to do that. So I'd love to do like a part two on Buddhism in the future, because it's so fun to talk about.
Yeah.
And there's so much more to cover, but this is a pretty good intro. I'm feeling pretty good about it, and I can feel the awakening starting to take place. So we did good.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Thank you. I think we're doing maybe autobiography next Sunday.
Cool.
Cool.
Do y'all want to do that? And then guests are coming in July. So
Yeah.
for anyone that's sick of us, get ready
Yes.
to have that sickness diluted
Other people.
by one other person that you might like. Alrighty. Thanks, guys.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
All right. See y'all next time.